In Mark 6, there's just a lot of background information that I want to present to you, and we'll do this in the form of a supplement. So we'll look at more on the background of Herod. We'll look at a passage from Josephus and a couple of Old Testament connections, one from the book of 1 Kings and the other from the book of Esther. First, let's start with Herod. So when we're reading the New Testament, we always want to ask which Herod, because a lot of times the gospel writers will just say King Herod. And if you don't know where you are in the timeline, it can get confusing. So in most of Jesus's adult ministry, anytime you see Herod, it's going to be Herod Antipas, and he's also known as Herod the Tetrarch. You can see on the map that he ruled Galilee and Perea is in modern-day Jordan. He is the son of Herod the Great. So in the birth narrative, the Herod we're reading about is Herod the Great, and Herod died in 4 BC. And so it's interesting that he had several wives, but Antipas's mother was actually a Samaritan. So the brothers that we'll talk about, the sons of Herod the Great, they're more like half-brothers, because Herod the Great had multiple wives. So Antipas's surviving brothers, Herod Philip and briefly Archelaus, they're also referenced in the Gospels. So Archelaus is mentioned when the Holy Family is coming back from Egypt, and Joseph heard that Archelaus was reigning in Judea, and that caused them to go up to Nazareth. Now, Archelaus didn't last that long. It was 4 BC to 6 AD, and then he was ousted because he was just awful. And then that's when you get the Roman procurators. And, of course, the best-known procurator for gospel readers is Pontius Pilate. So really, unless you're reading the birth narratives, just assume Herod Antipas whenever we read Herod in the Gospels. Now, that's not true in Acts, because we get more King Herods here. The first Herod we meet in the book of Acts is Agrippa the First, and that's actually Antipas's nephew. And his death is recorded in Acts 12, and history tells us that he died in the year 44. And then his son, Agrippa II, ruled the region afterwards. So always good to ask which Herod. Here's that coin from Herod the Tetrarch, Herod Antipas, and you can see on the back. Well, I don't know if you can see it, but on the back, on the coin on the right, it says Herod the Tetrarch. The gospel writers are suggesting that just as Herod saw John as a political threat, that Jesus is now an even greater political threat, because the one thing Herods wanted was their power, and they wanted their status and their title. Now, Herod the Great had to go to Rome to get the title King of the Jews. He did that in 39 BC, interestingly enough. But Antipas was never given that title, and he coveted it. And he always considered himself the rightful King of the Jews. And in 39 AD, he's going to approach, again, the Roman emperor, this time it's Caligula, for the title of king. And the paranoid Caligula did the exact opposite of what Antipas wanted. Caligula removed Antipas from office and then banishes him into exile. As we mentioned in the main Death of John study, throughout Jesus' ministry, Antipas has always been this behind-the-scenes antagonist, and Jesus appears to go out of his way to avoid any interaction with him. And the only time they'll ever see each other is at the end when Jesus is arrested. Pilate hears that he possibly was maybe a jurisdictional matter. I can wash my hands of this by turning him over to the Herod that's in charge there, but that amounted to nothing. Now, there's another Herod, Herod Philip, that is in charge. If you remember the map from a couple slides back, he's in charge of the northeast section. And here's a coin from Herod Philip here. And so he's over that region, and Caesarea Philippi, he named the region after himself. Don't confuse Caesarea Philippi with Caesarea by the Sea, which was the headquarters for Rome of Judea and Samaria. This is Caesarea Philippi is in the far north, and today it's up near the Lebanon and Syria borders. Now, it's interesting, if we look at these two coins side by side, Exodus 20, verse 4 is one of the Ten Commandments. It says, "You shall not make for yourself an idol or any likeness of what is in heaven above or the earth beneath or in the water under the earth." So Jews interpret this to mean there should never be an image or likeness of a person or animal anywhere. And as an aside, this is one reason that they reject Christianity. They can't reconcile statues of Mary or a crucifix containing a dead Jesus with a religion that claims to follow the Ten Commandments. So, just throwing that out there. Protestants would, of course, draw a distinction between having an item such as a coin, like a quarter with George Washington's image and likeness on the quarter, and we draw a line between worshiping that image. We don't have a problem with it because we don't worship it. But Jews are very strict in this area, and so be that as it may, Antipas ruled over a predominantly Jewish area. So look at his coins. His coins have no graven images. There's a picture of a palm tree and an olive wreath. When you compare that to Herod Philip, who ruled over Gentile regions, and then you can see his coins bear his name, image, and likeness on both sides. All through the Gospels, the leadership in Jerusalem and all of the Herods are bad shepherds. And so it's a theme of the Bible that we're contrasting bad shepherds juxtaposed against Jesus, who is the good shepherd. Antipas desired to be the king of the Jews, just like his father Herod the Great. Yet in the story we read in Mark 6, he is unable to follow basic Jewish ethical and moral standards. He can't do it. Most of us would say, we don't follow Jewish law, and yet we intrinsically know that adultery, stealing your brother's wife, and having your stepdaughter perform in a lewd manner is just entirely unacceptable. But Antipas didn't see it that way. So they're portrayed as Antipas and the Sadducees, people who should be shepherding the people, but they're just doing a terrible job of it. In contrast with Jesus, the true good shepherd, and John, who is Jesus' forerunner, all the while displaying courage, standing up to evil, and doing everything honorably. The Gospels make the case that Antipas is disqualified from being a shepherd over Israel by his actions. So we ask, why is this passage included when it really doesn't talk about Jesus? Well, it's showing how depraved Herod Antipas is and how unqualified he is to be the leader of the people. So in a role reversal, a beheading is supposed to be a shameful death. But here it's John who shows honor, and it's Antipas who is shamed by the Gospel's account. The Jewish historian Josephus largely corroborates what we read in the Bible. And so it's kind of interesting. We don't have a lot of extra biblical confirmation of what is in the Gospels, but this time we do. And so I think it's worth our time to explore that here. So we know, we talked about last time that Herod arrested John and had him bound in prison. And then it's from Josephus that we believe that the location of this was in Machaerus. Machaerus was this fortress palace that was on the east side of the Dead Sea. And again, it's according to Josephus where John was executed and imprisoned there. I think it's worth reading this passage just because it's fascinating. Look at something else that happened during the time of the Gospels. Josephus can be a little long-winded with the sentences, but I do think it's worth exploring. So I'm just going to read these couple of paragraphs here. About this time, Aretas, the king of Arabia Petra, and Herod had a quarrel on account of the following. Herod the Tetrarch had married the daughter of Aretas and lived with her a great while. But when he was once at Rome, he lodged with Herod Philip. Now, this is not the same Philip as the ruler in Caesarea Philippi. So, to make matters worse, Herod the Great had two sons, and he named two of them Philip, and in addition to his other sons, who was his brother indeed, but not by the same mother. For this Herod Philip was the son of the high priest Siroa's daughter. However, he fell in love. This is Antipas, fell in love with Herodias, Herod Philip's wife, who was the daughter of Aristobulus, their brother, and the sister of Agrippa the Great. This man ventured to talk to her about a marriage between them. So he's while she's married to some other guy, and while he's married to another gal, he's making the moves on Herodias, which address when she admitted an agreement was made for her to change her habitation and to come to him as soon as he should return from Rome. One article of this marriage also was that he should divorce Aretas' daughter. So Antipas when he had made this arrangement, sailed to Rome. But when he had done there the business he went about and was returned again, his wife, meaning the first wife, discovered the agreement he had made with Herodias. And having learned of it before he had notice of her knowledge of the whole design, she desired him to send her to Machaerus, which again, this is this very same place, which is a place in the borders of the dominions of Aretas and Herod. So it's kind of a border country, without informing him of any of her intentions. So the first wife is on to Antipas's scheme. And the way it worked with the Herods is that as soon as the wife lost favor with the husband Herod, the wife tended also to lose her life. And so she found out about this. She says, my days may not be long for this earth unless I flee. And so she heads back towards the region of her father and does it that way. So this is how, it kind of works out for Antipas, because he gets the first wife out of the picture that way. Accordingly, Herod sent her thither, thinking his wife had not perceived anything, and now she had sent a good while before to Machaerus, which was subject to her father, and so all things necessary for her journey were made ready for her by the general of Aretas' army. So you see, Josephus has a way with words here. And by that means, soon she came to Arabia under the conduct of several generals who carried her from one to another successively, and as soon as she came to her father and told him of Herod's intentions. So she escapes. She says, I'm just going to go down to your summer palace, and we'll meet later. But she has no intention of staying there. She goes to Machaerus and continues on into Arabia to meet up with her father. Now she tells her father why she's there. So Aretas made this first occasion of his enmity between him and Herod. No kidding, right? He had just shamed her daughter, he's about to, who had also had some quarrel with him about their limits at the country of Gamalitis. Now, Gamala is in the Golan Heights region, and it's on this borderland of Herod Philip's region. So it's interesting. We're talking about basically the Golan Heights, and so now we're going to turn into a border dispute as well as it's personal, because it's about the dude's daughter. So they raised armies on both sides and prepared for war and sent their generals to fight instead of themselves. And when they had joined battle, all Herod's army was destroyed by the treachery of some fugitives who, though they were of the tetrarchy of Philip, joined with Aretas' army. So we had some switching sides here. So Herod wrote about these affairs to the Roman Emperor Tiberius, who, being very angry at the attempt made by Aretas, wrote to Vitellius to make war upon him and either take him alive or bring him in bonds or kill him and send him his head. This was the charge that Tiberius gave to the president of Syria. So it's war now. You got Rome behind you, and we're going to go after this Aretas dude. Now, some of the Jews thought the destruction of Herod's army came from God. This is the interesting part, and that very justly as a punishment for what he did against John that was called the Baptist. For Herod slew him, who was a good man, commanded the Jews to John commanded the Jews to exercise virtue, both as to righteousness towards one another and piety towards God, and so come to baptism, for the washing with water would be acceptable to him if they made use of it, if not in order the putting away of the remission of some sins only, but for the purification of the body, supposing still that the soul was thoroughly purified beforehand by righteousness. So interesting, we're leaning into John the Baptist here. Now, when many others came in crowds about him, they were greatly moved or pleased by hearing his words. So John the Baptist was popular. Herod, who feared lest the great influence of John over the people might put his power and inclination to raise a rebellion, for the people seemed ready to do anything that John the Baptist would advise, thought it best by putting him to death to prevent any mischief he might cause, and not to bring himself into difficulties by sparing a man who might make him repent of it when it would be too late. So basically another telling of how Herod Antipas wiped out John the Baptist, executed John the Baptist. Accordingly, he was sent a prisoner out of Herod's suspicious temper to Machaerus, the castle I before mentioned, and was there put to death. Now the Jews had an opinion that the destruction of this army was sent as a punishment upon Herod and a mark of God's displeasure to him. And that's Josephus writing in Antiquities of the Jews. And so I think it's interesting. It's tough to read. It's a little bit outdated language, but Still, we get the point that Antipas was not a good guy, and this destruction of his army by his former father-in-law, by his first wife, was connected somehow to the death of John the Baptist. So I think that's interesting. Let's now turn to Elijah. And as we mentioned in the main study, it's somewhat reasonable for people to think Elijah would return from the dead. First, he didn't die. 2 Kings 2:11, and they were walking and talking. Behold, a chariot of fire appeared with horses of fire, and they separated the two of them, and then Elijah went up by a whirlwind to heaven. Malachi chapter 4 prophesied that Elijah would in fact return someday. Behold, I am going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord. He will turn the hearts of the fathers back to their children and the hearts of their children to their fathers, so that I will not come and strike the land with complete destruction. So Elijah is going to return in the last days. And in fact, in the Passover ceremony, it's common to leave an empty chair just in case Elijah shows up, playing on this tradition here. Jesus also said that John the Baptist was a form of Elijah in Matthew 17. Why then do the scribes say Elijah must come first? And Jesus answered and said, Elijah is coming and will restore all things. But I say to you, Elijah has already come. So he's already come and he is coming still. Perhaps a nod to the two witnesses in Revelation. They did not recognize him, but did to him whatever they wanted. So the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands. The disciples understood that he had spoken to them about John the Baptist. The mention of Elijah here is interesting, as this episode with Herodias and Herod Antipas bears some similarity to 1 Kings 21. So Antipas and his wife are acting out the roles of the wicked King Ahab and his scheming wife Jezebel. And there's a passage in 1 Kings 21 where they also plot the murder of an innocent person, and Elijah will show up at the end of that story. And so let's go ahead and read 1 Kings 21. Now it came about after these things that Naboth the Jezreelite had a vineyard, which was in Jezreel by the palace of Ahab, the king of Samaria. And Ahab spoke to Naboth, saying, Give me your vineyard, that I may have it for a vegetable garden, because it is close beside my house. I will give you a better vineyard in place of it. If you prefer, I will give you what it's worth in money. So we have the king coveting this poor guy's vineyard. But Naboth said to Ahab, The Lord forbid me that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. So Ahab entered his house sullen and furious because of the answer that Naboth the Jezreelite had given to him, since he said, I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers. Ahab lay his head down and on his bed, turned his face away, and ate no food. So he's the king, and he's sulking because he can't have this land. So just the definition of a spoiled brat here. But Jezebel, his wife, came to him and said to him, How is it your spirit is so sullen, and you are not eating food? He said to her, It is because I was speaking to Naboth the Jezreelite, saying to him, we have the story here again, Give me your vineyard for money, or else I will give you a vineyard in place of it. But he said, I will not give you my vineyard. Jezebel, his wife, said to him, Do you now reign over Israel? Aren't you the king? Arise, eat bread, let your heart be joyful. I will give you the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite. So she wrote letters in Ahab's name, sealed them with his seal, and sent the letters to the elders and the nobles who were living with Naboth in his city. Now she had written the letters saying, Proclaim a fast and seat Naboth at the head of the people. Seat two worthless men opposite him and have them testify against him, saying, You cursed God and the king, then take him out and stone him to death. So we have the woman Jezebel plotting the death of an innocent, and we just saw that in the Gospel of Mark. So the men of the city, the elders and the nobles lived in the city, did just as Jezebel had sent word to them, right? They were too scary to cross, so we're just going to follow orders here. Just as it was written in the letters, they proclaimed a fast, seated Naboth at the head. The two worthless fellows came and sat opposite him, and the worthless men testified against him, saying, Naboth cursed God and the king. So they took him outside and stoned him to death with stones. Then they sent word to Jezebel, Naboth has been stoned and is dead. And when Jezebel heard that Naboth had been stoned and was dead, Jezebel said to Ahab, Arise, take possession of the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite, which he refused to give you for money. For Naboth is not alive, but is dead. When Ahab heard that Naboth was dead, Ahab got up to go down to the vineyard of Naboth the Jezreelite to take possession of it. So this is deep state action at its finest, conspiring to take the land of a commoner. Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah the Tishbite, saying, "Arise, go down to meet Ahab, king of Israel, who is in Samaria. Behold, he is in the vineyard of Naboth, where he has gone down to take possession of it. You shall speak to him, saying, This is what the Lord says, have you murdered and also taken possession? And you shall speak to him, saying, The Lord says this, is this the place where the dogs licked up the blood of Naboth? In the place, the dogs will lick up your blood, yours as well." So we see John the Baptist as the form of an Elijah standing up to the wicked king and letting him have it even at his own risk of his own peril. So I think it's interesting. It's a great story in 1 Kings, and another great one is 1 Kings, where Elijah is having this duel with the priests of Baal, and choose this day. Why do you waver between two opinions? Some great passages in 1 Kings. A lot to learn from Elijah. There's also parallels here with Esther, and it's curious that the Gospels report Antipas as saying, "Up to half my kingdom," as this quote comes from the book of Esther. It's actually listed twice. First time is Esther 5, verse 3. The king said to her, "What is troubling you, Queen Esther? What is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be given to you." Now, both stories begin with a large party, most likely lots of drinking going on. Esther begins chapter 1, verse 3. "In the 3rd year of his reign, he, the king, held a banquet for all his officials and attendants, the army officers of Persia and Media, the nobles and officials of the provinces in his presence." So just like Herod Antipas threw this party for the leaders of Galilee, here the king of Persia is doing the same thing. Both stories with Herod Antipas and here with the king of Persia involve a woman asked to do a disgraceful thing in the case of Queen Vashti, or the woman actually doing a disgraceful thing in the case of Salome. Esther 1, verse 11, "To bring Queen Vashti before the king with a royal turban in order to display her beauty to the people and to the officials, for she was beautiful." And there's a lot of debate on whether this is anything lewd going on here or whether he's just showing off his trophy. Both case, either way, it's he's disgracing her and not treating her appropriately. Vashti ultimately declined to do the shameful thing, and she was banished. Esther 1:19, "If it pleases the king, let a royal edict be issued by him. Let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, so that it cannot be repealed. Vashti may not come into the presence of King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is more worthy than she." And so tradition says that Vashti may have been executed here, or at the very least she was just banished, and now we've got a vacancy in the queen position, and that's where Esther comes in here. So we fast forward a few chapters. We have this guy Haman, and the tradition is whenever you hear Haman's name, you have to hiss. And we saw that portrayed in the episode of The Chosen where they're celebrating Purim. Anytime Haman's name is mentioned, they hiss. So Haman now has it out for a Jewish servant of the king whose name is Mordecai. Haman plotted to have the king sign a decree that would wipe out not only Mordecai, but all of Mordecai's relatives. In other words, wipe out all Jews. Now, the lady that was elevated to queen after Vashti's banishment happens to be Esther, who is Mordecai's niece. Esther, of course, is Jewish and would be included in the planned genocide. So, the way the story unfolds is that only Esther is in a position to thwart Haman's plan. Mordecai informs Esther that she needs to confront the king. And it's during this moment of hesitation that Mordecai speaks this tremendous passage here. Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, "Do not imagine that you are in the king's palace and can escape any more than all the other Jews. If you keep silent, liberation and rescue will arise from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this." And I love that passage, and a lot of us know that verse, but we may not always know the context in which it was spoken. But I think it's true that God puts little and sometimes not so little opportunities before us all the time. And, are we in our place to do something about it for such a time as this? And so our responses should be, if not now, when? And if not me, who? We need to say, "Hineni, here I am, Lord, and send me." And of course, that's what Esther ends up doing. So Esther musters up the courage to speak to Haman, and that's a possible death sentence to go before the king uninvited. So she's making a bold move here. And then we get to Esther 7, and it's one of the greatest turnabouts in all of literature. She arranges a banquet with Haman and the king. And note, we have another banquet here. There's only one woman present. But instead, this time instead of doing something shameful like Salome did, Esther is now heroic. Now, Esther 7, verse 1, now the king and Haman came to drink wine with Esther the queen. And the king said to Esther on the second day, also as they drank wine at the banquet, what is your request, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you. What is your wish? Up to half the kingdom, it shall be done. So again, that echoing that phrase that Herod Antipas used for Salome. Then Queen Esther replied, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me as my request and my people as my wish. And so you can imagine the king going, what are you talking about? Esther continues, for we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed and eliminated, killed. Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men and women, I would have kept silent because the distress would not be sufficient reason to burden the king. So Esther's virtuous request really contrasts with Salome's depraved request to bring the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Then King Ahasuerus asked Queen Esther, who is he and where is he that would presume to do such a thing? And here's the turnabout. Esther said, a foe, an enemy, is this wicked Haman, who's sitting there right there with a glass of wine and probably just dropped that glass of wine to the ground. And, this is a true wanna-get-away moment for Haman. Then Haman became terrified before the king and queen. Yeah, I'll bet. And this part is just hilarious here. The king got up in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace garden, but Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. Do you think? Now, when the king returned, this is hysterical, from the palace garden into the place where they had been drinking wine, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. The king said, will he even assault the queen with me in the house? And word went from the king's mouth. They covered Haman's face. So just, you have to imagine this. Ahasuerus walks in on Haman pleading with Esther, and it looked like he's putting the moves on her. And so, of course, the king just loses it at this point. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs who stood before the king, said, indeed, the wooden gallows standing at Haman's house 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, spoke good on behalf of the king. So there's a backstory here that Mordecai stood up for the king during a rebellion, and the king had planned to praise Mordecai, but here's Haman, planning to kill Mordecai. The king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the wooden gallows, which he had prepared for Mordecai, and the king's anger subsided. So just a fantastic story, but very true. It's a true story, how genocide was planned for the Jews in Persia and how one woman, Queen Esther, saved it. And so this is celebrated today in the Feast of Purim. It's a minor feast, and it's usually celebrated in February, and they read the story and they celebrate. The Jews have several feasts. Hanukkah is another one that they talk about God's deliverance from a planned genocide, and Hanukkah talks about the period during the Greek Empire, where this guy named Antiochus Epiphanes had plotted to wipe out the Jews. They had to eat pork under penalty of death, and a lot of them, just chose to die rather than eating pig. So they didn't compromise at all. If you found anyone circumcised, they would be killed, and then that leads to this revolt, which is then celebrated as Hanukkah. So the Jews have a saying: they tried to kill us, they failed, let's eat, because they have so many festivals that play off of God's delivering them from the time of trouble. So one commentator noted, just as God used the debauchery of one king's drinking party to work salvation for the Jewish people, so he used the death of John to prepare the way of salvation. So he's talking about the first chapter in Esther where they asked Vashti to do something lewd. And so if Vashti was executed, then her death created the opportunity for Esther to arise and save her people. And then in the same way, John's death moves the spotlight onto Jesus. And we looked at in the main video how that's a good thing, but it's also a double-edged sword because it drew some unwanted attention. Lastly, in the Christ-centered exposition commentary, we have these comparisons between John the Baptist and Herod. So John, wore camel skins and camel hair, and Herod Antipas had royal robes. John was humble and simple. Herod was flamboyant and ornate. John was righteous. Antipas was debaucherous. John could not be bought. Herod definitely could be bought. He was put on the spot by a 12-year-old girl who had just done, something unspeakably lewd. Courageous for John, spineless for Herod. Clear conscience versus a troubled conscience. John maintained his integrity and lost his head, whereas Antipas forfeited his integrity and lost his soul. And John is a man of the spirit, and Herod Antipas represents a man of the flesh. So just some thoughts going into the background of the story of John the Baptist and how it plays on Elijah and Esther. And we have this comparison, and we look into the background of Herod. So hopefully this helps add some color and context to what is just a great story and a great example of courage in John the Baptist, and not caving during the face of evil. So hope that helps. We'll look at next time will be the feeding of the 5,000, and we'll see you along the Talmidim way.